At the peak of his power, the man you are about to hear about was worth the modern equivalent of $400 billion. He was richer than anyone alive today. He was so wealthy that his personal net worth was equal to 2% of the entire economy of the United States. He controlled 90% of all the oil refined in America. He illuminated the homes of the world, and then he fueled the automobiles of the 20th century. His name was John Davison Rockefeller. He built a monopoly so terrifying and so powerful that the United States government had to invent entirely new laws just to tear it apart. But he did not build this empire by discovering oil or striking it rich in a muddy field. He built it through absolute ruthless calculation. He built it by controlling the transportation of the oil and secretly suffocating his rivals in the dark. He created a system where his competitors were actually paying him a tax every single time they tried to sell their own products. He bought out competing factories for pennies on the dollar by giving them a choice between submitting to his empire or facing total financial annihilation. This is not a story about a failed company making a mistake. This is the story of the ultimate apex predator of the business world. This is the story of Standard Oil and the blueprint for the greatest monopoly in human history. To understand the absolute cold calculation of John Rockefeller, you have to look at the man who raised him. His father was named William Avery Rockefeller, but everyone simply called him Devil Bill. Devil Bill was a traveling salesman, a con artist, and a bigamist. He would disappear for months at a time, traveling across the country selling fake herbal remedies and magic potions that he claimed could cure cancer. He would pretend to be a deaf and mute doctor to trick people into giving him their money. But the most bizarre thing about Devil Bill was how he treated his own children. He would actively cheat his own sons in business deals. He would lend John money and then demand it back with exorbitant interest at the most inconvenient times. Devil Bill famously told a neighbor that he cheated his boys every chance he got because he wanted to make them sharp. Because his father was completely unreliable, the young John Rockefeller had to become the responsible adult of the house. He was quiet, deeply religious, and obsessed with order and control. At the age of 16, he got a job as an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio. He was paid 50 cents a day. He bought a small red ledger book and tracked every single penny he earned and every single penny he spent. He called it Ledger A, and he kept it in a safety deposit box for the rest of his life. He learned that in business, numbers do not lie, and emotion is a weakness. He noticed that the people making the most money were not the people taking massive wild risks. The people making the most money were the middlemen who controlled the flow of goods. This obsession with accounting and eliminating waste would become the foundation of his entire philosophy. He believed that saving a fraction of a cent on a process was just as good as discovering a gold mine, and he was about to apply that exact philosophy to the most chaotic industry on the planet. In 1859, a man named Edwin Drake successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It sparked a massive gold rush, but instead of gold it was black, thick, sticky crude oil. Thousands of people rushed to Pennsylvania hoping to strike it rich. It was a scene of absolute chaos and madness. The towns were covered in mud and smelled of sulfur. Because everyone was drilling right next to each other, the oil would shoot out of the ground and flood the streets. Wooden derricks caught on fire and burned entire camps to the ground. The price of a barrel of crude oil would swing wildly from $20 a barrel down to 10 cents a barrel in a matter of months. Men would become millionaires on a Tuesday and go completely bankrupt by Thursday. John Rockefeller traveled to Pennsylvania to look at the oil fields. He looked at the drilling process and was completely disgusted by it. He saw it as gambling. Drilling for oil required luck, and Rockefeller hated relying on luck. You could spend your life savings drilling a hole in the ground and find absolutely nothing. But Rockefeller noticed a completely different opportunity. When the crude oil came out of the ground, it was useless to the average consumer. It had to be cooked and purified into kerosene before it could be poured into a glass lamp and burned for light. Before kerosene, people used whale oil to light their homes, but the whales were being hunted to extinction, and whale oil was incredibly expensive. Kerosene was the future of global illumination. Rockefeller realized that he did not need to own the muddy, unpredictable oil wells. He just needed to own the factories that turned the crude oil into the valuable kerosene. He needed to become the toll booth between the chaotic drillers and the millions of customers who wanted to light their homes. He decided to get into the refining business. In 1863, John Rockefeller partnered with an older businessman named Morris Clark and a brilliant chemist named Samuel Andrews. Together they built an oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. At the time, refining oil was a very primitive process. Most refiners just boiled the crude oil, collected the kerosene, and dumped the leftover sludge directly into the local river. The rivers in Cleveland would literally catch on fire because there was so much waste oil floating on the surface. But Rockefeller refused to waste anything. He viewed waste as a sin against God and a sin against his ledger book. He instructed his chemist, Samuel Andrews, to find a use for every single drop of the crude oil. Instead of dumping the gasoline, which was considered a useless explosive byproduct at the time, they used it to fuel the machines inside the factory. Instead of dumping the heavy tar, they sold it to paving companies to build roads. They turned the leftover sludge into lubricating oil for railroad wheels. They collected the waxy residue and sold it to companies making chewing gum and candles. They even took the thick jelly scraped from the bottom of the barrels. and sold it to pharmacies as a healing ointment called Vaseline. Because Rockefeller sold all of his waste products, his refinery made more money per barrel than anyone else in the world. This allowed him to lower the price of his kerosene and still make a massive profit. But he did not stop there. He realized he was paying too much money for the wooden barrels used to transport the oil, so he bought his own forest of oak trees. He bought his own kilns to dry the wood. He hired his own coopers to build the barrels. He cut the cost of a wooden barrel from $2.50 down to less than $1. He brought everything inside the company. This is called vertical integration. Within a few years, his refinery was the most efficient and profitable factory in Cleveland. He bought out his partner Maurice Clark for $72,000 and took complete control of the business. In 1870, he officially incorporated the company and named it Standard Oil. He chose the name Standard because he wanted customers to know that his kerosene would never accidentally explode in their living rooms, which was a very common problem at the time. He guaranteed a standard of absolute safety, but operational efficiency was not going to be enough to conquer the world. He needed a secret weapon. The biggest problem in the oil business was not pulling it out of the ground or cooking it in the factory. The biggest problem was moving it. Cleveland, Ohio was strategically perfect because it sat right on the edge of Lake Erie and had access to multiple major railroad lines. The railroads were the most powerful corporations in America during the late 19th century. They desperately needed heavy freight to make money. 3 major railroads were fighting a brutal price war to carry the oil from Cleveland to the massive markets in New York and the East Coast. John Rockefeller saw this price war and knew exactly how to use it to his advantage. He went to the most fearsome railroad tycoon in the country, a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt. Rockefeller made Vanderbilt an offer that was impossible to refuse. He promised to guarantee Vanderbilt a massive steady flow of 60 train cars of oil every single day of the year. This guaranteed volume allowed the railroad to plan their schedules perfectly and save a massive amount of money on logistics. But in exchange for this guaranteed volume, Rockefeller demanded a secret discount on the shipping price. This secret discount was called a rebate. While all the other competing oil refineries were paying the standard public rate of 40 cents a barrel to ship their oil, Standard Oil was secretly paying only 15 cents a barrel. This secret handshake completely destroyed the free market. Rockefeller could now ship his oil, sell it in New York for a cheaper price than it cost his competitors just to produce it, and still make a handsome profit. His competitors could not figure out how Standard Oil was selling kerosene so cheaply. They thought Rockefeller was somehow operating at a loss. They did not know about the secret railroad rebates, and Rockefeller demanded that the railroads keep the rebates completely confidential. If a railroad ever told the public about the discount, Rockefeller threatened to take his 60 train cars a day to a competing railroad and bankrupt them. He played the massive railroad monopolies against each other and turned them into his own private delivery service. But even the secret rebates were not enough for his ambition. He was about to devise a scheme so ruthless that it would spark riots in the streets. In 1871, John Rockefeller organized a secret alliance that remains one of the most diabolical business plots in history. He partnered with the largest railroad companies and a few of the biggest oil refiners to create a fake corporation called the South Improvement Company. The goal of this fake company was to permanently eliminate all competition in the oil industry. The mechanics of this scheme were breathtakingly evil. The railroads agreed to immediately double the freight rates for all independent oil refiners, but the members of the South Improvement Company would still receive their massive secret rebates. That was bad enough, but the second part of the deal was the true stroke of dark genius. Rockefeller demanded a mechanism called the drawback. The drawback meant that every time an independent competing refinery shipped a barrel of oil on the railroad would take the extra money they charged that competitor and hand it directly in cash to John Rockefeller. Read that again? Rockefeller was not just getting a discount on his own oil. He was secretly collecting a tax on the oil shipped by his direct enemies. His competitors were unknowingly financing the expansion of Standard Oil every time they put a barrel on a train. The railroads agreed to this insanity because Rockefeller controlled so much volume that they were terrified of losing his business. They also agreed to send Rockefeller a daily report of every single shipment made by his competitors. Rockefeller knew exactly who his rivals were selling to, how much they were selling, and what price they were charging. He had completely hacked the entire physical supply chain of the United States economy. He could look at a competitor in Pennsylvania and know exactly how much money they had in the bank, and lower his prices in their specific town until they were completely starved of oxygen. Armed with the devastating power of the South Improvement Company, John Rockefeller initiated a 6-week campaign of corporate slaughter. Historians now refer to this period in early 1872 as the Cleveland Massacre. At the time, there were 26 independent oil refineries operating in Cleveland, Ohio. They were all fiercely independent businessmen who hated Standard Oil. Rockefeller invited them to his office one by one. He sat them down and very calmly explained the reality of the situation. He showed them the contracts he had with the railroads. He showed them his accounting books, which proved his factories were infinitely more efficient than theirs. He told them that the era of independent refining was over and that they were going to go bankrupt if they tried to fight him. Then he offered them a choice. They could sell their refinery to Standard Oil right then and there, for a price that Rockefeller determined was fair. He would pay them in cash, or he would pay them in shares of Standard Oil stock. If they accepted the offer, he promised them a steady job and a share of the massive profits to come. If they refused the offer, he promised to crush them completely and send them into absolute bankruptcy. It was the ultimate mafia tactic wrapped in polite business attire. He never raised his voice, and he never lost his temper. He believed he was actually doing them a favor by saving them from the inevitable chaos of the free market. The independent refiners were furious. Some of them screamed at him and threatened him. But when they went to the railroads to complain, the railroads told them the rates were fixed. When they went to the banks to get a loan to fight back, the banks refused to lend them money because Rockefeller had already warned the bankers that the independent refiners were doomed. They were completely trapped. In just 39 days, John Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 competing refineries in Cleveland. He shut down the inefficient factories and absorbed the good ones into Standard Oil. Overnight, he went from being a large regional player to controlling 25% of the entire American oil refining capacity. And the men who were smart enough to take the Standard Oil stock instead of the cash ended up becoming incredibly wealthy multimillionaires. The men who took the cash faded into absolute historical obscurity. After conquering Cleveland, Rockefeller turned his eyes to the rest of the country. He moved into Pennsylvania, New York, and Baltimore using the exact same ruthless tactics. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. It was a monopoly of staggering proportions. But this massive size created a massive legal problem. During the 19th century, corporate laws were incredibly strict. A corporation chartered in the state of Ohio was legally not allowed to own property or operate businesses in the state of New York or Pennsylvania. To get around this law, Rockefeller had been secretly buying refineries in other states and forcing the original owners to pretend they still ran the company. It was a web of shell companies and secret handshakes. It was legally dangerous and a massive headache for the Standard Oil accountants. Rockefeller needed a new legal structure to manage his global empire. He turned to a brilliant corporate lawyer named Samuel Dodd. Samuel Dodd invented a completely new concept in corporate law. He created the Standard Oil Trust. Under this brilliant legal fiction, all the stockholders of the dozens of different secret companies handed their shares over to a board of 9 trustees. John Rockefeller was the head of the trustees. In exchange, the stockholders received trust certificates which entitled them to a share of the overall profits of the entire combined empire. This meant that the 9 men sitting in a boardroom at 26 Broadway in New York City had absolute dictatorial control over a massive network of companies operating across the entire country. The state governments could not do anything about it because technically Standard Oil of Ohio did not own Standard Oil of New York. The trustees owned both of them. This invention of the trust changed American capitalism forever. It was immediately copied by the sugar industry, the steel industry, and the tobacco industry. It is the reason we still use the word antitrust today to describe laws that break up monopolies. Even with 90% of the market-controlled Standard Oil, still faced moments of extreme danger. The independent oil producers in Pennsylvania were desperate. They were sick of being completely controlled by Rockefeller's railroad monopolies. So in 1878, they decided to bypass the railroads entirely. They pulled their money together to build an ambitious engineering marvel called the Tidewater Pipeline. It was going to be a massive iron pipe stretching 110 miles over the Allegheny Mountains to carry crude oil directly to the eastern seaboard. If this pipeline succeeded, it would completely break Rockefeller's grip on transportation. Rockefeller realized the existential threat immediately. He did not just complain about the pipeline. He deployed the full, devastating weight of the Standard Oil empire to stop it. First, he used his immense wealth to secretly buy up narrow strips of land exactly in the path where the pipeline was supposed to be built. When the independent engineers arrived to lay the pipe, they found out they were trespassing on Standard Oil property and had to spend months rerouting the pipeline through treacherous mountains. Second, he went to the railroads and organized a massive boycott. He told the railroads to completely slash their freight rates to pennies just to bankrupt the pipeline company before they could finish building. Third, he unleashed a campaign of physical sabotage. Standard Oil hired men to literally tear up the pipes in the middle of the night. There were armed standoffs in the forests of Pennsylvania between the pipeline workers and the railroad thugs paid by Rockefeller. But despite all the sabotage, the independent producers were determined and they eventually finished the Tidewater Pipeline. When the oil finally flowed through the pipe and proved the technology worked, the independent producers cheered. They thought they had finally beaten John Rockefeller, but they severely underestimated his absolute lack of ego. Rockefeller looked at the successful pipeline and realized that pipelines were inherently cheaper and better than railroad cars. He did not waste time being angry that he lost the initial battle. Instead, he immediately ordered Standard Oil to build their own massive network of pipelines all across the country. Because he had infinite capital, he built a network of pipes so large and so efficient that the Tidewater Pipeline could not possibly compete. Within a few years, the independent pipeline company was bleeding cash and on the verge of bankruptcy. Rockefeller calmly swooped in and bought a massive minority stake in the Tidewater Pipeline, forcing them into the Standard Oil monopoly. He had taken his enemy's greatest weapon, improved upon it, and used it to enslave them once again. By the 1880s, Standard Oil was not just an American monopoly. It was a global superpower. Rockefeller was exporting thousands of barrels of kerosene to Europe, Asia, and South America. He brought light to the darkest corners of the globe. Standard Oil salesmen would travel to remote villages in China and give away small tin oil lamps for free just to create a permanent demand for Standard Oil kerosene. It was the ultimate razor and blade business model executed on a planetary scale. But in Europe, he faced competitors who were just as wealthy and just as ruthless as he was. The Nobel brothers, who had invented dynamite, had discovered massive oceans of crude oil in Baku, Russia, and they were financially backed by the legendary Rothschild banking family in Paris. The Rothschilds and the Nobels teamed up to flood the European market with cheap Russian oil. It was a clash of absolute titans. The richest banker in Europe fighting the richest industrialist in America. Rockefeller responded by unleashing a massive price war across the European continent. He slashed the price of Standard Oil kerosene so low that he was losing millions of dollars a month in Europe, but he subsidized those losses by raising the price of kerosene back home in the United States, where he had no competition. He literally used the money of the American consumer to finance his global war against the Rothschilds. He also launched a brilliant marketing campaign. Russian oil was known to be slightly more dangerous and prone to smoking when burned. Standard Oil painted all their barrels bright blue and told the European consumers that only the blue barrels contained safe American kerosene. The battle raged for years. Eventually, the Rothschilds and the Nobels realized that Rockefeller was completely irrational and would gladly burn his entire fortune to the ground before he ever surrendered a single inch of market share. They secretly sued for peace and agreed to carve up the global markets, forming a massive global cartel behind closed doors. Rockefeller had successfully fought the most powerful banking family on earth to a complete standstill. John Rockefeller was incredibly secretive. He never gave interviews to the press. He told his executives to communicate in cipher codes when sending telegrams. He believed that the less the public knew about the inner workings of Standard Oil, the safer the company would be. But you cannot control 90% of the oil in the country without making thousands of bitter, angry enemies. One of those enemies was a woman named Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell grew up in the oil regions of Pennsylvania. Her father was an independent oil producer who was financially ruined by the South Improvement Company scheme and the subsequent Cleveland Massacre. She watched her father struggle and suffer while John Rockefeller became a billionaire. Ida Tarbell grew up to become an investigative journalist. They called them muckrakers at the time because they raked up the muck and the dirt of the corrupt corporate elite. In 1902, she began publishing a massive 19-part series in McClure magazine called The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was a masterpiece of journalism. She spent years digging through obscure court records, finding old railroad contracts, and interviewing the broken men who were crushed by Rockefeller. She exposed the secret rebates. She exposed the hidden shell companies. She exposed the predatory pricing and the espionage. For the first time in history, the American public saw the actual brutal mechanics of how a monopoly was built. The public outrage was absolutely deafening. People burned effigies of John Rockefeller in the streets. Political cartoons portrayed him as a giant octopus wrapping its tentacles around the United States Capitol building and the White House. He became the most hated man in America. He received thousands of death threats and had 2 higher armed guards to protect his massive estates. The public pressure became so intense that the federal government could no longer look the other way. The politician who took up the sword was the new young president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was known as the trust buster. He believed that massive corporate monopolies were a direct threat to the democratic foundation of the United States. His administration used a piece of legislation called the Sherman Antitrust Act to sue Standard Oil in federal court. The legal battle was an absolute nightmare that dragged on for years. The government lawyers subpoenaed John Rockefeller, forcing him to testify in court. He sat on the witness stand as an old man, frail, and completely bald from an autoimmune disease. He played the part of a forgetful old grandfather. When the lawyers asked him about the secret railroad rebates and the South Improvement Company, he calmly claimed that his memory was failing him and he could not remember the details of deals made 30 years ago. But the paper trail collected by Ida Tarbell was too overwhelming. The government proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Standard Oil had engaged in illegal, predatory pricing and anti-competitive behavior. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down the most important corporate ruling in history. They ordered that the Standard Oil Trust must be completely dismantled and broken up within 6 months. The court ruled that the company had acted as an unreasonable monopoly in restraint of free trade. The massive global empire was ordered to be chopped up into 34 completely separate and supposedly independent companies. The era of the Standard Oil monopoly was officially dead. The public celebrated it as a massive victory for the common working man. The newspapers declared that the great beast had finally been slain. But they did not understand the true genius of John Rockefeller. They had just handed him the greatest financial gift in the history of capitalism. When the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil to be broken up, John Rockefeller was retired and playing golf in New York. A messenger ran onto the golf course and handed him a telegram with the news of the breakup. Rockefeller read the telegram, turned to his playing partner, and calmly told him to buy as much Standard Oil stock as he possibly could. Here is the ultimate irony of the entire story. When the company was broken into 34 different pieces, Rockefeller received proportional shares in every single one of those new companies. He owned a massive piece of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which would eventually become Exxon. He owned a massive piece of Standard Oil of New York, which would become Mobil. He owned a massive piece of Standard Oil of California, which would become Chevron. When these 34 companies were split apart, their true individual value was finally revealed to the public stock market. The combined value of the separate pieces was significantly higher than the value of the original single monopoly, and there was an external technological miracle happening at the exact same time. A man named Henry Ford was mass-producing the Model T automobile. Suddenly, millions of cars were driving on the roads, and those cars needed gasoline to run. Gasoline was the exact same highly explosive byproduct that Rockefeller used to dump into the river or burn for cheap fuel 50 years earlier. Overnight, the waste product of the kerosene industry became the most valuable liquid on Earth. The demand for gasoline skyrocketed, and the value of the 34 baby Standard Oil companies exploded into the stratosphere. Because he held massive amounts of stock in all of them, John Rockefeller's personal net worth doubled and then tripled. The Supreme Court ruling that was meant to punish him actually made him the first official billionaire in human history. He spent the last 40 years of his life giving away half of his fortune to medical research and education, hoping to buy back the public goodwill he had completely destroyed. John Rockefeller wrote the absolute playbook for building a monopoly. Every modern technology giant, from Amazon to Google, uses variations of his strategies today. Here are the 3 brutal lessons from the rise of Standard Oil. Lesson 1. Control the bottleneck, not the resource. Rockefeller knew that drilling for oil was a terrible business full of risk and chaotic competition. He let other men take the risk of pulling it out of the ground. He focused entirely on the refining and the transportation because every single drop of oil eventually had to pass through his factories to be useful. If you control the toll booth, you control the entire highway. Amazon does not manufacture every product on their website, but they completely control the logistics and the delivery, making them the ultimate modern toll booth. Lesson 2. Extreme efficiency is a deadly weapon. Standard Oil was not just a successful company because of illegal kickbacks. They were genuinely the most efficient manufacturing company on Earth. By owning their own barrel factories, their own pipelines, and utilizing every single drop of waste product they drove their internal costs down to a microscopic level. When you are fundamentally more efficient than your rivals, you can lower your prices to a level that is profitable for you but absolutely bankrupts your competition. Efficiency gives you the stamina to win a price war. Lesson 3. The illusion of competition. For decades, the public thought they were buying kerosene from dozens of different local independent companies. They had no idea that Standard Oil secretly owned almost all of them. Rockefeller kept the original names on the factories to prevent the public from realizing a monopoly had formed. When a competitor thinks they are fighting a local rival, but they are actually fighting a globally funded empire, the war is over before it even begins. John Rockefeller proved that free markets naturally trend toward monopoly, unless an external force intervenes. He brought order to a chaotic industry, illuminated the world, and built a mountain of gold on the broken backs of the men who refused to surrender.